What's going on, guys, and welcome on back to Second and Short, the NFL-based podcast where we talk about all and anything the NFL. Today's episode is a Friday, which means Fantasy Fridays, which means I am going to discuss my studs, duds, and sleepers for Week 10 of the NFL season. Let's get started. Kicking off our duds this week is Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders is going up against the New York Giants, a very poor New York Giants team. Now, this New York Giants team has actually been okay against the running back position. Granted, teams are throwing on them at such a high rate that they're not really needing to run the ball. Here's the thing. They're ranked 22nd against the running backs. Miles Sanders projected about 18.5 points. I think he's going to exceed that, jump into the 20s. He's finally back after 3 weeks rest after injuring his knee. Now, this is a total boom or bust. I'm going to keep going through this, but this is a boom or bust situation. Because he's injured, he's not going to be 100% off the 3 weeks rest, but he is going to be healthy enough to go out there and perform. Here's the positives. He's had 4+ targets in all of his games, except for week 6 when he got hurt, where he only had 2. Every other week, he has had 4+ targets, which is good for PPR receptions. He's going to get lots of yardage. He is a more explosive runner. He's better at receiving than Boston Scott, who in week 7 against the New York Giants had about 18.5 fantasy points. He was good for 12 carries, 46 yards, 3 receptions, 46 yards as well, and a touchdown. Look for Miles Sanders, who has more open field agility, to get more yards this week than Boston Scott did, to potentially get a touchdown as well and have just as many receptions. I predict that Miles Sanders will be in the 20+ point range and is going to start to separate the Eagles from the rest of the pack in their division. Now for our next stud, and this is kind of cheating. It is the Green Bay Packers offense. I don't see a single player that I at least wouldn't want to flex. Aaron Rodgers, Aaron Jones, Davante Adams are all top 10 at their own position. They are each projected to get over 22 fantasy points per ESPN PPR standards. Let's break down what they have done, and then we're going to break down why I think they're going to stand out this week. What they have done so far this year, Davante Adams. Over the past 4 weeks, since returning from his injury and the bye week, Davante Adams has 36 receptions for almost 500 yards, 6 touchdowns off of 47 targets. He has only been held under 10 targets in week 2 of his 6 games, and that is because he got hurt. Outside of that, he has hit 10+ targets every game. Look for that to continue against this Jacksonville Jags defense. He is going to be dominant, as this Jags team cannot really stop anybody, especially one of, if not maybe, the best receiver in the game right now. Aaron Jones. He only has 1 game over 100 yards rushing, yet he's still 8th among all running backs in PPR formats due to his pass catching prowess. He's getting 4+ targets every week. He has 7 touchdowns in 6 games. He is a scoring machine up to this point. He has had some, issues with being out there every game, but to be honest, as long as he's out there, I don't care. I know he's going to be good for about 3 to 4 catches. He's going to get somewhere between 60 and 80 yards, and he's probably going to punch one of those things in for a touchdown. Look for Aaron Jones to continue his scoring streak and keep adding to this. Aaron Rodgers. Oh man, Aaron Rodgers was so underrated coming into this season, and what happens for all that? He just rewards the person that took him at the end of the draft. Aaron Rodgers is number 3 among all quarterbacks right now. He is also a scoring machine. He's 24 touchdowns for 2 interceptions. He has 1 fumble loss as well. He's, for some reason, playing like an MVP and not getting talked about as an MVP. The Green Bay Packers right now have 23 total red zone touchdowns, which is a huge plus for Robert Tonyan. The Green Bay Packers are number 1 in time of possession, number 3 in total points, and number 3 in just passing touchdowns in general. Look for everybody here to dominate, as the Jags are 30th in points allowed per game, They're 26 in passing yards per game and 26 in rushing yards per game. Like, they're allowing everybody to get onto them. And here's the reason why. They're 32nd in sacks. They don't get pressure. Aaron Rodgers is going to have 10 seconds every play to do whatever he wants. So if you got a Green Bay Packer and they're a stud, start them. If they're not a stud, like Alan Lazard, who potentially is coming back as the time of this recording, or MVS, flex them. Robert Tonyan is a decent tight end start as well. And Michael Crosby is also a great start at kicker because they always have the ball. They're going to get into the red zone. Now let's talk about some duds. And for duds, this is tricky because this week there's a lot of good matchups everywhere. And anybody that kind of has like a bad matchup, really, it's not that bad. And I think they're all traps too. Which brings me to our first dud, and that's Joe Burrow, quarterback of the Cincinnati Bengals, traveling to the Pittsburgh Steelers this Sunday. Here's the thing. This is a trap game for me. I think the Bengals have a good chance of winning this game. I think the Steelers are going to be overlooking them, pushing past, and everything I'm about to say could be wrong just because of how the way sports work. But if we're playing off of what we know and what should happen, Joe Burrow's projected 18 fantasy points. Now, a couple weeks ago, he went up against a similar defense in the Baltimore Ravens and was held to 4 fantasy points. I think this is going to replicate here today. He only has 11 passing touchdowns on the year. Yeah, I know he has 3 rushing touchdowns as well, but through 8 games, 11 passing touchdowns is not what you want from your high-profile passing, option, especially when the run game isn't as strong as it is in Cincinnati. No quarterback has scored over 19 fantasy points against the Pittsburgh Steelers this year. That includes holding Lamar Jackson, Carson Wentz, Ryan Tannehill, Baker Mayfield. All have been held under 19 fantasy points in a time when quarterbacks are throwing like crazy, scoring points like crazy. I think, Ryan Tannehill scored like 18.2 points or whatever against them. Everybody else has been held in check, and I think that's going to be more of the same here. The Pittsburgh Steelers are top 8 in all defensive categories, except for passing touchdowns, which they're 13th. The Pittsburgh Steelers right now are number 1 in sacks, number 1 in interceptions, and number 1 in fumble recoveries. Not only are they preventing people from getting lots of yards, they're holding onto the ball longer on offense than they're letting other teams. Defenses are getting off the field quicker, and whenever they do try and move, they're having them turn over the ball or sacking their quarterback more and more. Joe Burrow will get under 18 fantasy points this week unless the fantasy gods and the way sports work is Pittsburgh Steelers just somehow choke this game, which shouldn't happen, but it might. Now let's move on to our next dud, and it's going to be duds. I'm going to do the same thing I did with Green Bay earlier. I'm going to talk about the Baltimore Ravens offense. And we are almost at the point where it's going everywhere, all across the internet. They're talking about it. Can you even start the Baltimore Ravens? Mark Ingram's been hurt. J.K. Dobbins has been inefficient outside of a few games. At receiving position, outside of Marquise Brown, there's been really nothing to date. I mean, even Marquise Brown has been so-so. He's wide receiver 41 on the year. He's only averaging 10 fantasy points as well. Outside of Mark Andrews and Lamar Jackson, really nobody is dominating that well. And even then, Mark Andrews is 8th among tight ends, and Lamar Jackson's 12th among quarterbacks. Considering these guys were both drafted in the top 3 of their position this year in fantasy, they've been underperforming. Only Jackson, Brown, and Andrew are projected to get over 10 fantasy points. And even then, I think potentially that might fall off. Because the New England Patriots, although they're only got 3 wins on the season, their defense is kind of holding up in most situations. Now, granted, against the New York Jets on Monday night, they allowed Joe Flacco to get some deep touchdowns. Blown coverage allowed for this to happen. Otherwise, they kind of kept him in check when it came to short yardage game. 3 weeks before that, against Buffalo, San Francisco, and Denver, they held everybody under 13 fantasy points. They even held Patrick Mahomes to 20 fantasy points. Are you going to start Lamar Jackson? Of course you are, because you drafted him early and you don't have another quarterback. You're going to need him to get a rushing touchdown because he's not throwing a lot of touchdowns this year. Only one tight end has scored a touchdown all season, and that was back in week 3, and they let that happen to Darren Waller, who they actually held in check the rest of the game. And Travis Kelce is the only tight end to get over 55 yards when he had 75 yards a couple weeks ago. So be wary. Obviously, touchdowns change this game. If Lamar Jackson throws 2 touchdowns or runs for a touchdown or 2, it's going to change how these things look. But in the long run, be careful of starting Baltimore Ravens. Now it's time for some sleepers. And our first sleeper is Brandon Cooks, who has kind of come back to life. We saw early in the season, not as much, he had that blank game he had in like week 3, but over the past 4 weeks, Brandon Cooks has come back to life. I mean, he's had 9+ targets in all these games. He's averaging 20.8 fantasy points over this time frame per game. On the year, surprisingly, he's got 37 catches, 510 yards, and 3 touchdowns in 8 games. Like, he's on pace to have another 1,000-yard season with another team. The Cleveland Browns have allowed 12 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers in these 8 games. They're also 28th versus wide receivers in fantasy. The only time they've had a great week was week 8 against the Raiders, when they held them in check to like 15 total fantasy points among all wide receivers, yet they still rank in the bottom 5. That's what's amazing about this. They're 23rd in passing touchdowns allowed and 23rd in red zone touchdowns and 25th in points in total. Even though this Browns team is 5-3 right now, they're having to win shootouts. And because they're having to win shootouts, opposing teams in fantasy are getting lots of points. So, Will Fuller's been on an impressive touchdown streak. That might continue. That does not mean that Brandon Cooks is not also going to outperform his projection. So look for Brandon Cooks to have one of those big weeks potentially here against Cleveland Browns in a shootout. The Texans are not out of this game, until the fourth quarter. But I'm just saying, the whole game, they're going to be scoring points. That sounds stupid. With the way the Texans play, Deshaun Watson, he's going to air it out. He's going to get 300+ yards. I wouldn't be surprised if 100 of those yards go to Brandon Cooks. He's going to get 9 more targets, potentially a touchdown. And if he does, you're going to be looking at anywhere from a 17 to 20 point fantasy game for your flex spot. And finally, our last sleeper and last fantasy topic of this podcast is Eric Ebron, the tight end. We don't talk about tight ends a lot on our fantasy podcast because tight ends are very predictable in my eyes. Like, you see guys that are at the top and you're like, they're going to perform like they're supposed to. I mean, we're going to see Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, those guys are going to dominate George Kittle when he was healthy. And then other tight ends are going to do what they do. And they're, TJ Hawkinson's going to get 8 to 12 points. And Greg Olson's going to get 4 to 7 points. Like, stuff like that is just going to, what's going to happen. Eric Ebron is going up against Cincinnati Bengals, who are 31st versus the tight end. On average, they allow opposing tight ends to get about 5 to 6 catches, 68 yards, and almost a whole touchdown. If that stat line holds true, if we just give them the low on all that, 5 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown puts him at 17 fantasy points in PPR formats. That's tremendous, especially since he's only projected 9.6 points. Vance McDonald has already been ruled out of this game. And we don't know what's going to happen to Big Ben, but no matter who they put in at quarterback, the tight end is very reliable because Cincinnati is 23rd in passing touchdowns allowed and 23rd in red zone defense for touchdowns as well, which is going to benefit Eric Ebron. Remember, this guy back in 2018 had 13 receiving touchdowns. He's got back-to-back weeks of touchdown here. I wouldn't be surprised if this streak continues. And that is going to do it for us here on our Studs, Duds, and Sleepers edition from Second and Short and our Fantasy Friday episode. Thank you guys for tuning in and listening. Be sure to click that subscribe button down below to stay up to date on everything that is Second and Short. Click the like button as well because it is the cheapest way to support our podcast. And leave a comment down below for your studs, duds, and sleepers are of the fantasy week. Be sure to check us out on all social media outlets such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Links are in the bio. And if you want to switch over and maybe listen to one of these on audio only, we're on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. All those links are down below as well. Thanks for listening and good luck in your guys' fantasy matchup.